That can of tuna in your pantry is lined with something you've probably never thought about because it's not an ingredient, it's not even food. It's a thin epoxy resin coating on the inside of the metal can itself. And for most of the past several decades, that coating has commonly been made using a chemical called bisphenol A or BPA. The European Union has moved aggressively to eliminate BPA from food packaging over the past several years, culminating in a full ban on its use in food contact materials. The FDA's position, across multiple safety reviews spanning more than a decade, has remained that BPA is safe at current permitted levels, including in can linings, with no equivalent federal prohibition. This video is about why that gap exists, what BPA actually does, and why it's used in the first place, and why this is one of the more genuinely contested scientific disagreements we've covered on this channel. Not a case where one side clearly has better evidence, but a case where two respected regulatory bodies looked at substantially the same research and reached very different conclusions about how much caution it justified. Let's start with why BPA ends up inside a tuna can at all. Canned food, tuna especially, tends to be acidic or salty, and without some kind of barrier between the food and the metal can itself, that acidity and salt content would corrode the can from the inside, contaminating the food with metal and dramatically shortening shelf life. Epoxy resin linings solve that problem effectively. They're durable, they resist the specific chemical conditions inside a can of tuna or coconut milk, and they've been the dominant lining technology in commercial canning for decades, specifically because they work so reliably. BPA is a key building block in the specific type of epoxy resin most commonly used for this purpose, prized for the same properties that make it useful in a wide range of other plastic and resin applications: durability, heat resistance, and a smooth, stable surface. The safety concern centers on BPA's classification as an endocrine disruptor, a substance capable of mimicking or interfering with the body's natural hormone signaling, specifically estrogen in BPA's case, because its molecular structure is similar enough to estrogen that it can bind to some of the same biological receptors. Research into BPA's potential health effects has explored a wide range of possible outcomes over the years, including reproductive development effects, associations with certain hormone-sensitive cancers, and more recently, effects on metabolic health and immune system function. The European Union's regulatory response to this research built gradually over more than a decade, rather than arriving all at once. An early, narrower step came in 2011 when the EU banned BPA specifically from baby bottles, reflecting particular concern about infant exposure during a developmentally sensitive period. That was followed by a series of scientific reassessments from the European Food Safety Authority, each one generally moving in the direction of greater caution as new research accumulated. The most significant of these came in a major 2023 EFSA opinion that dramatically lowered the agency's tolerable daily intake figure for BPA, its estimate of how much a person can safely be exposed to on an ongoing basis, by a truly enormous margin compared to the agency's own previous standard, based substantially on newer research pointing to potential immune system effects, specifically changes in certain immune cell activity that EFSA's scientific panel judged could plausibly translate into increased risk of inflammatory or autoimmune conditions at exposure levels far lower than previously assumed to be a concern. Following that dramatically lowered safety threshold, the European Commission moved to prohibit BPA's use in food contact materials across the EU entirely, phasing out its use in can linings, food packaging coatings, and related applications. In the United States, the FDA has conducted its own repeated safety reviews of BPA over roughly the same period, most notably a comprehensive updated assessment released in 1914, and the agency's consistent conclusion across these reviews has been that BPA remains safe for use in food contact applications at the levels currently found in the American food supply. The FDA's 2012 rule banning BPA specifically from baby bottles and sippy cups is worth understanding precisely because it's often mischaracterized. The FDA was explicit that this specific ban was based on what's called abandonment, meaning manufacturers had already voluntarily stopped using BPA in these specific products in response to consumer demand by the time the rule was finalized, and the FDA was formally codifying that market reality into regulation rather than making a new safety determination that BPA itself was unsafe. Outside that narrow, already abandoned product category, the FDA has not moved to restrict BPA in the broader range of food packaging applications where it's still used, can linings included, and has specifically declined to adopt the dramatically lower safety threshold EFSA settled on in its 2023 reassessment. This is genuinely one of the more contested scientific disagreements in this entire series, and it's worth being honest about that rather than presenting either side as simply correct. It's also worth noting that BPA has become something of a cautionary tale in its own right about the challenges of replacing a well-understood chemical with alternatives that haven't been studied nearly as extensively. Several of the substitute compounds developed specifically to replace BPA in food contact applications, sometimes labeled BPS or BPF, are structurally quite similar to BPA itself, and a growing body of more recent research has questioned whether some of these replacement chemicals might carry similar endocrine disrupting properties to the substance they were meant to replace, simply with a much smaller existing body of safety research behind them precisely because they're newer to widespread commercial use. Neither the EU nor the US has moved to comprehensively regulate this entire class of BPA alternative compounds. The way EU regulation has now addressed BPA itself specifically, which means BPA-free labeling, while a genuinely meaningful signal about the one specific compound this video is focused on, isn't necessarily a guarantee that a product's packaging is entirely free of every chemically related compound raising similar underlying questions. EFSA's dramatically lowered safety threshold drew real pushback, including from some independent toxicologists and industry-funded reviews who argued that the specific immune effect study driving that reassessment hadn't been adequately replicated by other independent research teams, and that basing such a large safety margin reduction on a single line of evidence, however concerning, represented an unusually aggressive application of the precautionary principle, even by the EU's own historical standards. EFSA's defenders have countered that the agency's mandate is specifically to apply precaution when a plausible, biologically coherent mechanism of harm is identified, even before every possible confirming study has been completed, and that waiting for additional replication before acting risks leaving the public exposed during the years that additional research would take to conduct. The FDA, for its part, has reviewed some of the same underlying research and reached a different weighting of the evidence, concluding it doesn't yet justify departing from its existing safety standard. Reasonable toxicologists and regulators on both sides of the Atlantic genuinely disagree here in a way that's more scientifically unsettled than several of the other substances we've covered on this channel. It's worth understanding a bit more about how BPA exposure has actually been measured in real populations, because it's part of why this issue reached the level of regulatory attention it has on both sides of the Atlantic. Biomonitoring studies, research that measures actual chemical traces in blood or urine samples from representative population groups have consistently found detectable BPA in the large majority of people tested across multiple countries, including both the US and EU, reflecting just how widespread BPA has been across food packaging, receipts, and various consumer products for decades, not just canned food specifically. That widespread background exposure is part of what made the question of any single additional exposure source, like a can lining, more scientifically contested than it might otherwise be. Regulators aren't evaluating BPA exposure from tuna cans in isolation. They're evaluating it as one contributing source layered on top of an already substantial baseline exposure most people carry from multiple directions simultaneously, which makes isolating the specific health effect of any one exposure pathway, including can linings specifically, a genuinely difficult research problem. It's also worth understanding why the EFSA's 2023 immune effect findings specifically was treated as such a significant departure from the agency's own prior position, rather than simply an incremental update. Earlier BPA safety assessments going back years had focused primarily on reproductive and developmental endpoints, effects on hormone-sensitive tissue development, particularly in animal studies examining prenatal and early life exposure. The immune system mechanism identified in the newer research represented a genuinely different biological pathway than what earlier assessments had centered on, which is part of why it prompted such a dramatic downward revision in the acceptable exposure threshold rather than a more modest adjustment. The EFSA scientific panel concluded that this newly identified mechanism appeared to produce meaningful effects at exposure levels far below what the agency's previous assessments, focused on different biological endpoints entirely, had established as a safety threshold. It's worth being fair to the American market here too, because federal inaction hasn't meant zero change. This is another example of the voluntary reformulation pattern that's shown up across nearly every video in this series. Starting in the mid-2010s, well before the EU's most recent and most dramatic regulatory action, a number of major American food manufacturers began voluntarily shifting toward BPA-free can linings, using alternative coating technologies based on materials like acrylic or polyester resins instead of BPA-based epoxy. Some smaller specialty food companies were early adopters of this shift, specifically to capture growing consumer demand for BPA-free products, years before larger mainstream brands followed with their own transitions. That shift has continued gradually across the industry since, entirely driven by consumer preference and competitive pressure rather than any federal requirement, which means the American can lining landscape today is considerably more mixed than a simple framing that BPA is still legal. Therefore, every can has it would suggest. Some cans do, some don't. And the only reliable way to know which is checking the packaging directly, since the ingredient itself, being part of the can rather than the food, doesn't appear on the ingredient list at all. This is exactly why tuna specifically became such a focal point for this concern, and it's not the only canned product where the same underlying lining question applies. Coconut milk, another product that's acidic and commonly sold in cans, uses essentially the same epoxy lining technology for the same anti-corrosion reasons and carries the identical BPA exposure question, just with less public attention historically directed at it compared to tuna. Anything canned and acidic or high in fat, tomato products, coconut milk, certain canned fruits, runs through broadly the same lining chemistry question, which means this isn't really a tuna-specific issue so much as a can lining issue that happens to be easiest to discuss, using tuna as the clearest, most recognizable example. So practically, here's what you can actually check the next time you're buying canned goods. First, look for BPA-free printed directly on the can or label. This has become a common enough voluntary claim across the American market that a meaningful share of major brands now display it prominently, specifically because they know it's become a purchasing consideration for a real segment of shoppers. Second, if a can doesn't make any claim either way, know that the absence of a BPA-free label doesn't necessarily mean BPA is definitely present. Some manufacturers have made the underlying formulation switch without updating their packaging to advertise it, since the change itself doesn't require any regulatory disclosure either way. In the US, the label is a useful, positive signal when present, but its absence isn't a reliable negative signal on its own. Third, if avoiding this exposure pathway matters enough to you that you want more certainty than can labeling alone provides, pouched products, tuna pouches instead of cans, for example, generally use different packaging materials entirely, avoiding the metal can epoxy lining question altogether, though it's worth knowing that pouch materials carry their own separate set of packaging chemistry questions that aren't necessarily risk-free either, just a different set of considerations than the specific BPA question this video has focused on. This channel compares food and product standards across the US, UK, and EU using publicly available regulatory information, including EFSA's 2023 bisphenol A risk reassessment, the resulting EU food contact material restrictions, and FDA safety review documentation from 2008 and 2014. Content is for informational and entertainment purposes only and isn't medical advice. This remains an active area of scientific and regulatory disagreement, and both the underlying research and each agency's position may continue to evolve. So always check current official sources for the latest developments. We are not affiliated with or endorsed by any brand, company, or organization mentioned. Next time, we're staying in the canned goods aisle for a second product built around this exact same lining chemistry, coconut milk, and why a product most people assume is just coconut and water carries the identical can lining question tuna does. Subscribe if you want to see exactly how it compares.